The following program is brought to you by Caltech.
I'm Tom Sofer, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Stephen Wolfram, who's the founder of Wolfram Research, the creator of Mathematica, the author of A New Kind of Science, and the creator of Wolfram Alpha. Obviously, from the number of people here, he needs no introduction, so I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes. Stephen is here to receive tomorrow the Distinguished Alumnus Award from Caltech. He graduated with a PhD in theoretical physics in 1980. Well, most of us were deciding what we would be taking as juniors in college. Stephen was graduating with his PhD from Caltech. And I think he still has the record as the youngest PhD ever awarded by Caltech. Obviously, theoretical physics was, he conquered all of theoretical physics that he needed to, and so he moved on and decided to conquer the rest of science. And he's done that with having this enormous impact on all of science with Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha. So without any further ado, delighted to introduce Stephen, who will talk about adventures in science, technology, and business after Caltech.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I've set myself up for a slightly challenging technical situation here, so that weird things will happen with slides and so on. But so what I thought I would do, might be of interest, is I'll tell you a little bit of sort of story of my life and times mixed in with some science, technology, business kinds of things. And perhaps there are useful lessons, interesting things to learn, and so on. So before I was at Caltech, I grew up in England. I went to fine schools there. I got interested in physics when I was pretty young. First I was interested in the space program, which was sort of hot in the 1960s when I was growing up. And then I got interested in kind of how does this stuff really work underneath, and got interested in physics and learned that even in those days before the web, you could bicycle to the university library and read books and things and learn all sorts of stuff about physics. And by the time I was about 15, I was starting to write physics papers and publish papers about particle physics and things like that. I went to college briefly when I was 16 and went on sort of doing physics research and so on, and decided that I should accelerate things and go to graduate school, and wound up. It was sort of an interesting process because I never graduated from college, and some schools said, oh, no, you can't be a graduate student here if you don't have a college degree. But Caltech was enlightened enough to say, well, you've published a bunch of papers about theoretical physics, so it's probably a reasonable possibility as a graduate student. So I came to Caltech in 1978, I think, and ended up working in particle physics, theoretical particle physics, which was at that time sort of a wonderful hot field where all kinds of things were being discovered, and it was sort of an exciting time in the fourth floor of Lauritsen Lab and so on. And I got my peak productivity was publishing a paper every 2 weeks for a little while. And the only thing that was surprising is that those papers have actually survived very well. In fact, I was very proud that one paper that I wrote when I was 19 during my paper every 2 weeks period was a thing about a method for understanding the structure of particle events, which actually still gets used at the LHC and is used somewhere in the infrastructure of discovering Higgs particles and things. So that was nice to realize. But so I thought I got fairly good at doing theoretical physics kinds of things. One of the big problems in doing theoretical physics that I had was that you have to do all these calculations, and you have to work out all these things with complicated chunks of algebra and things like that, and I was never particularly good at that, and I always found it incredibly boring and incredibly mechanical. And so one of the things I sort of said was, this is really boring. It should be, why do humans have to do this? And so I got interested in whether one could sort of automate that process. Well, actually, one of the things that I had done when I was a kid in England, I had managed to get access when I was about 13 or something to a computer, which in those days was a big thing the size of a large desk that you program with paper tape and all those kinds of terrible things. And I had So I had learned a bit about programming computers, and I'd ended up, when I sort of decided that, I really liked doing physics, but I really didn't like doing all sorts of algebraic computation and so on. So I thought, how can one do this algebraic computation automatically? And I found that there were a bunch of kind of research type systems that existed in the world for doing algebraic computation. And at that time, the ARPANET was new, and there were 512 hosts on the ARPANET, and host number 236 was a terrific project at MIT that involved doing algebraic computation, and there were a bunch of other ones, a bunch of other things like that. And so I ended up starting to use these kind of projects that have been done for algebraic computation, and before very long I ended up, I think, being the world's largest user of algebraic computation systems. And that was 1979, and actually I got my PhD. I should have made a bigger effort to get a PhD while I was still a teenager, which I could easily have done. But at the time, I didn't think that would be a good story to tell, and I wasn't thinking ahead to what to do. Then what ended up happening was got my PhD, and right after that, I was like, okay, so what am I going to do now? Because I kind of had this goal of be a theoretical physicist, and I sort of at that point sort of was a theoretical physicist, and so what does one do next, so to speak? And so I realized, I need better tools to do the kinds of things I want to do, physics, whatever else. And so I actually went, I think I went from Caltech, I went to visit CERN, and I spent a couple of weeks, and I wrote sort of the first pieces of sort of a design for computer system for doing mathematical and algebraic computation. At the time, I thought I better learn something about whatever is known about computer science. I better learn it, because I knew a bunch about programming and things, but I thought there's this discipline of computer science. And so I remember going to the Caltech bookstore, which I see is still in the same place 30 years later. And at that time, I went and decided I will buy all books in the bookstore about computer science. And so it wasn't it was a little partial shelf at that time, and I spent a weekend kind of going through all the books that existed at the time on computer science to get to the point where I thought I knew something reasonable about that. And so then embarked on building this software system. It was called SMP, stood for Symbolic Manipulation Program, that was intended to kind of be a tool that I could use for doing physics and so on. So that process was very interesting of sort of building a software system, and involved all kinds of students and others around Caltech and so on. And it was after a while we'd kind of built the system. I think in 1981 or so it was the first version of it existed and was running. There was then a whole horrible disaster, which I can go into if people are interested, but that had to do with, okay, so what do you do with this thing? You've got a software system, and it's actually running, and it's useful to me, and it's useful to lots of other people in the world. What do you do with that? Well, in today's world, it's obvious. You do a startup. Back in 1981, that wasn't so obvious, and my first thing was go and talk to the university technology transfer people and see what they have to say. And eventually they said, well, you better just do a startup, because they didn't call it a startup in those days. And unfortunately, that was there was sort of a whole horror story of which let me not digress on, which was about intellectual property issues and all sorts of bad behavior on the part of university administrators and all sorts of terrible things that one doesn't want to repeat. The end result of which was I said, I quit. Goodbye. I'm out of here. And if it hadn't been for that, I probably still would be at Caltech today. I might still be a physics professor or something. But as it was, whether for better or worse, I left there, started a company that was, I made many mistakes in starting my first company. It was a sort of in today's world, a fairly standard venture capital funded company with sort of some professional management, which means not me, and involved in running it. And the company actually eventually, after many twists and turns, eventually went public many years after it sort of stopped doing things that I considered at all interesting. But that was actually one question you might ask is what happened to SMP? So SMP got used at the time it was sold on things like VAXs and big so-called mini computers, which were actually very big computers. And actually here's a funny story, which maybe will have an interesting ending soon. So ahead of my time, I decided we'll protect the source code of SMP by encrypting it. And so we encrypted it, and we have this encrypted source code. And needless to say, we lost the password. And worse than that, I had been clever enough, in a sense, to say, we'll not use a standard encryption system. We'll take the Unix script program and we'll modify it, because somebody will break the standard version sooner than they'll break a modified version. So I was actually about to put out a challenge of, we have a copy of the encrypted version of the source for the modified Unix script program. And it has to be the case that now, after all these years, it's possible to just break this and get back the source code of SMP and recompile SMP, because it no longer runs. All the machines on which it ran have died off. But anyway, SMP was an interesting. It was interesting because for me it was sort of my first effort at designing a large software system, a large language. And I did many things which were, I thought, pretty interesting ideas, but they turned out to be sort of, in a sense, too far out for the users. And it was fascinating being able to see, design the software system, you wait 5 years, then you read the training manuals that people write about your software system, and that's when you discover what the design mistakes in your software system were, because those are the things where they say, my favorite was the section which began, there was things called marks, which were some not very good idea in the language design, and it said marks are the enigma of SMP, and that's kind of for a language designer, that's the, that was a screw up. So, in any case, the result of a combination of sort of the adventure with SMP and other things, I'd been interested. So in physics, I'd gotten interested in. I'd initially been interested in particle physics. I got interested in cosmology and things like that. I've been interested for a long time in questions about sort of how does there end up being order and structure in the universe. And actually, the one course that I taught at Caltech was about that subject. Then the thing that I'd sort of been curious about is, okay, how do you think scientifically about the emergence of sort of complex things in the world? And that's something where on the one side, I was interested in that. On another side, I'd gotten interested in kind of AI-ish kinds of things, because I'd been working on the software system, and it was like, how do I generalize from this to make a whole sort of AI kind of thing? And so on the one hand, I was sort of interested in things like how do galaxies form in the universe. On the other hand, interested in kind of AI kinds of things. And the question is, what's in common between these interests? And what I sort of realized was there's this kind of general question of how does complex stuff get made anywhere in the world, and I sort of got interested in how do you think about that, and I realized that sort of having had this experience of building the software system kind of gave me the idea that let me just if I drink water I won't cough at you, maybe. So anyway, the sort of having built the software system, I kind of had this idea that you could start from nothing and kind of invent a kind of a model, a theory of things. And so I got kind of interested in what would it take, was one able to sort of find, just sort of create artificial versions of nature that you could then study and so on. So much later I kind of realized a much sort of clearer way to explain what I was thinking about, which was basically, for about 300 years, kind of the dominant form of way of thinking about making models for natural systems has been, you make mathematical equations to describe how nature works. What I had kind of realized was you could kind of generalize that, and you could say, well, what if I just use arbitrary rules that might be represented in a program? What then happens when you try and think about describing the natural world and so on? So just to skip forward in the story, I mean, I ended up discovering some things that I thought were pretty interesting pieces of science. Maybe let me just tell you the sort of the end of the story, and then I'll come back and describe some more of the details. So I worked in the, no, maybe let me talk about the science. Otherwise it has no context. All right, let me see. So the question really is, if you think about if you imagine sort of the natural world as being something which is created by simple rules that can be represented by programs, what kinds of programs might they be? Well, programs that we're used to dealing with are big, complicated programs that we write for particular purposes, and they're thousands, millions of lines long, and so on. But the question that's sort of a basic science question is, if you just look at the sort of computational universe of possible programs, what do typical simple programs do? And so the very first type of program that I started looking at with these things called cellular automata. This is a typical example, and it's just a line of black and white cells. At every step, the color of a particular cell is determined by the color of the cells above it and to its left and right. And it has just a very simple rule. You can represent it by the little icon at the bottom there. Started off from one black cell at the top. Follow that rule, you just get this simple pattern. So then the question is, what happens when you change the program? So change it a bit, you get a checkerboard. Change it a little bit more, you get some kind of pattern like this. If you continue running that, you'll get a pretty intricate pattern, but it's a very nested, very perfect, regular pattern. So at this point, you might be thinking, simple enough program, I've got to have very simple behavior in the actual system that I produce. And that was kind of my first assumption. But a long time ago, when I was at Caltech, actually, I decided, okay, I better just write the trivial program to just enumerate all possible programs of this kind and go print out the results, in those days on a line printer, which some of you have heard of at least. And then go and see what actually happens. Well, you get all sorts of, so each number here corresponds to a different possible program, a different possible rule. The first one that's really a surprise is rule 30. And if we show a bigger picture of that, this is what it does. You start off from just one black cell there and follows that very simple rule, generates this quite complicated pattern of behavior. And the thing that, if you continue it a while longer, you get this kind of fairly elaborate pattern. So there's some amount of regularity over on the left, but many aspects of this picture look, for all practical purposes, completely random. Like, for example, the center column here is something that we used for many years as a pseudorandom generator in Mathematica, and it's really very, very random. So it's a really bizarre thing, and it's sort of an intuition-breaking thing, as far as I was concerned, that, you know, I had sort of always assumed that to get really complicated things in nature and engineering, whatever else, you needed to have sort of complicated rules and go to lots of effort to do it. But here's a case where just searching in this computational universe of possibilities, rule number 30, you run it, there's the rule, and you get all this complicated stuff. So this started me on a whole adventure in science, and turns out this phenomenon is a very general phenomenon. So there's another cellular automaton that does it. Here's a Turing machine. That's a very simple Turing machine. The very simplest sort of few Turing machines do fairly simple things, but it doesn't take long in the world of Turing machines before you start seeing things like this, where it's sort of the same kind of behavior. That's the rule for the Turing machine at the bottom. Same kind of behavior. I mean, just this turns out to be, we found, I put on a little competition about 6 or 7 years ago now to see whether this particular Turing machine is universal. And so now we know this is in fact the simplest universal Turing machine that can exist and does exist. But it's it's in this sort of the space of possible systems. It turns out that this phenomenon of simple rule, complicated behavior is quite ubiquitous. I mean, there's some recurrence relations which show it. You can even go into sort of the heart of traditional mathematical science and look at partial differential equations. Those are some sort of standard textbook ones. But if you just start sort of sampling the space of all possible partial differential equations, you quickly find all kinds of complicated behavior that's very much like the behavior of Rule 30. It would be harder to discover here because we use these as tests for the numerical differential equation solving capabilities in Mathematica, but it's hard to know with a differential equation whether the actual output that you're getting is the real output from the equation or whether it's some kind of problem with your numerical scheme. So it would have been much harder to discover this phenomenon in one of these kinds of continuous systems. In any case, then, so just to go back to the story, so I had figured out some of these kinds of things in the early 80s, and so I went started publishing all kinds of papers about these kinds of things, and lots of enthusiasm got generated, and I decided there's this really pretty interesting area of science which is sort of studying complex systems and studying the general sort of theory of complexity, so to speak, and how it arises. So I thought, this is a cool thing. Let me kind of tell people this is a really good direction for people to go in. There's all kinds of interesting basic science to be done and so on. Well, so I did that. And I started a journal about that field, and I went and produced lots of essentially marketing material for the field. And the problem was it was just so slow. At least for me at that age, it was so slow to see things happen. It was like, well, in 2 years this might happen, in 3 years, 5 years, whatever else. So I in fact I went around to a bunch of different universities, and I said, I think it'd be really interesting to have a sort of an institute that studies complexity kinds of things. And so particular University of Illinois was the sort of the place that was gave sort of the best deal for starting this there. And so we started the thing up and hired a bunch of faculty and so on. And but it was still a very glacial kind of process, seeing kind of external funding coming in and other people getting excited about this. So my first idea was crowdsource the science, so to speak. I had defined a direction and get the world to kind of do the kinds of the kind of direction that I thought was interesting in science. I was getting frustrated that it was going too slowly, so I thought, okay, what about is there a plan B? Well, my plan B turned out to be a convenient time around 1986 that. I thought, okay, I built SMP. I can do something like SMP, but a lot better. And it also was a time when personal computers were first to the point where they could run a sophisticated software system. And so then I started building Mathematica, and I said, okay, my sort of plan B is build this system that will be sort of a terrific tool that will be the thing that I'll be able to use sort of for the rest of my life to do computational kinds of things. And also, by the way, I can make a tool that's pretty useful to lots of other people and build a company and make sort of an environment where I can do the kinds of things that I want to do. So that was kind of plan B that I embarked on in 1986. So for a few years, I worked very hard building the first version of Mathematica and then the second version of Mathematica. I started our company, and this time around I decided I'm going to be the CEO. And it's much better that way, and I've continued to be the CEO today. It works out. I've had a good time doing that, it was something where started building Mathematica. Things were growing very nicely. I decided, okay, my goal here was actually to make a tool that I could use to do sort of science kinds of things. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to take a year or so and go and pursue these directions in science. Well, it turned out that I discovered a lot more than I expected to discover. So the 1 year stretched into 10.5 years. I ended up building this sort of this big book called The New Kind of Science, and a whole bunch of science that was in there, which I can talk a little bit about. Then that finished in 2002, and then I've sort of been back to doing technology and things with the company, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. But maybe let me just talk about the science, because I think the science is interesting. So one of the things that you do is to say, well, okay, given this realization that in the computational universe there's all this sort of rich behavior that occurs even with very simple rules, how's that relevant to what actually happens in nature? And if we kind of look at different systems in nature, pick your favorite snowflake or something and ask the question, let's make a model that sort of captures the essence. It may not get every detail, but let's try and do, as every model does, it will ignore certain things and capture other things. Let's try to sort of capture the essence of what's going on. It turns out it's pretty easy to make a simple see if I can get it to come alive. No, that didn't work. Okay, let's see if that worked. Okay, well, so it's pretty easy to get a simple cellular automaton rule that sort of captures growth inhibition and so on, and which turns out to give a pretty good representation of what happens with snowflakes. And if what you're interested in is sort of what's the bulk behavior of a large collection of large sort of population of snowflakes, something like that, this gives you really good results. If you're interested in what's the precise curvature of the tip of a snowflake arm, this is a bad kind of model to use. But it gives you a lot of information about sort of what the overall complexity of what's going on is. Lots of other places, you look at fluid dynamics and things. Made a simple model based on sort of cellular automata as idealization of molecular dynamics that turns out to do a rather good job and lets you understand things about turbulence and what the sort of the origin of randomness in turbulence is. or you can go on and look at biological systems, and you can make all kinds of models for different kinds of biological things that go on. One of the interesting questions in biology is, if you look at sort of the space of all possible rules for things, how well does biology populate that space of all possible rules? Or does natural selection somehow carve out this funny little tiny corner? It turned out this is an example from mollusk shell growth shapes, where you go into, you generate sort of all possible parameter values, and then you go to a mollusk museum and you say, do you have a mollusk that looks like this, this, and this? And the answer is always yes, except that with every mollusk there's a story. So the pointy ones, they're that way because they get wedged in rocks and do this, that, and the other. But nevertheless, you go from the parameter space to there's a mollusk for every one of these cases. And the nice things happen, like if you look at the pigmentation patterns on mollusks, it turns out you get patterns that look very much like the the dynamics of producing them is closely related to these things like Rule 30 cellular automaton. There's just a growing lip of tissue on the mollusk that extends out. So all kinds of things that you can think about and conclude. Actually, there's sort of some basic science issues that come up, like how do you understand sort of the fact that a simple program like this can make very complicated behavior? There's this idea I call the principle of computational equivalence, which sort of explains what's going on there. And so, sort of the notion is this: if you have a system, and you can think of any system as sort of performing a computation. There's some input at the beginning, it grinds through, it produces some output. And you can ask the question, how sophisticated is that computation? And you might think, you start with a very simple program, you make the program progressively more sophisticated. The computation will get progressively more sophisticated as the program gets more sophisticated. What seems to be the case is that that's not true. Once you get beyond some very trivial level of computation, you immediately jump to having sort of the maximal level of computational sophistication, which means that lots of these systems are equivalent in the sophistication of computations that they do. And that's kind of why, when we look at a system like this, it's sort of us, our brains or our mathematics or whatever versus the system competing for sort of computational ability. Can we jump ahead and figure out what the system is going to do, or do we have to just, are we limited to doing computation sort of in the same way that the system does? And this principle of computational equivalence tells us that we have to be sort of more realistic about the observer in sort of the same kind of way that, in something like relativity or something, one had to be more realistic about the observer to understand better what was going on. This is a sort of computational analog of that. And this is a case where, so this principle of computational equivalence sort of explains, in a sense, why there's this appearance of complexity here. It also has predictions like this idea of computational irreducibility. Can one jump ahead in predicting what a system will do in the way that, can you find the closed form formula for what will happen that allows you to figure out with just a simple substitution into the formula what the system will do, or do you have to sort of follow through each step and just essentially do a simulation to find out what will happen? This computational irreducibility idea says that often, in a case like this, almost certainly, you have to go and sort of follow through that every step. So you end up with, we end up with a bunch of predictions. One thing you might conclude is that this principle of computational equivalence would tell you, for example, that most of these systems that are not obviously simple should be universal computers. So, for instance, the first one of those that was found was the Rule 110 cellular automaton. There it is, starting from a random initial condition. That turns out to be universal. We don't yet know whether Rule 30 is universal. I strongly suspect that it is, but it may take a while to find out. As I mentioned before, I put up this prize a few years ago for that particular Turing machine, say, is it universal or not? I thought this might be an open problem for 100 years, but a young chap in England, after about 4 months, managed to produce this really very non-trivial proof that it actually is universal, which is great evidence for this principle of computational equivalence. Well, so there are all kinds of consequences of this principle of computational equivalence. I'll talk about some more in a minute. But one of the things, so you can kind of start asking, so given that we have this sort of different intuition from this computational universe about how things work, how does that inform what we do in science and technology, other places? So, for instance, in science, one of the obvious questions is, okay, we've got this whole universe out there. How does the I don't have the best pictures here. How does the, is it possible that our whole universe can be derived from some very simple rule? You know, we know that our universe is not as complicated as it might be because, you know, there are definite laws. Not every particle in the universe does its own thing. There are definite sort of common laws for what goes on. The question is, how simple is the actual underlying rule for the universe? And is the underlying rule for the universe something which can be represented in something like a program, or is it something that goes beyond anything we know right now and is not representable that way? So if it is a program, kind of what kind of program is it? And once you have a very simple program, once you imagine that it might be a very simple program, there are lots of immediate consequences, like nothing that we are familiar with will be visible in that program because it's just too small to pack that stuff in. Things like that. And you end up realizing you have to sort of go underneath space and time and so on to have some sort of lower level infrastructure for what's happening. And you also realize that there are going to be many equivalent representations for what you do. But one that I've found quite useful is to just think about giant networks of nodes and to imagine that sort of the universe is just some giant network of nodes that get updated according to some simple collection of rules, or like one or two of these, and then just say, okay, you know, in the limit of a very large network, it will behave like continuum space. What kinds of things actually happen there? And you can get all kinds of funky structures and so on. What you realize is, well, there are all kinds of very non-trivial results that come out, like there are results where you can derive in the same kind of way that you go from molecular dynamics to large-scale fluid mechanics, you can derive sort of what are the continuum equations for a universe like this, and you discover that you actually get Einstein's equations, which is really encouraging for certain aspects of how this universe works. And you can go and sort of say, well, let's just start enumerating universes and ask, where's our physical universe in the space of all possible computational universes? And some you can easily reject. You can say it's obviously not our universe. Time stops after just a few moments, or, you know, space, there's no connection between different areas of space. The interesting thing is that it doesn't take long before, none of these are actually examples, but it doesn't take long before you start seeing universes that are obviously not our universe. And for which, unfortunately, you're sort of bitten by computational irreducibility because there's a lot of billions of years of evolution of our universe, and you have to be able to jump ahead a bit to be able to compare sort of your computational universe with the actual universe that we have. So, you know, lots of implications of this kind of science for where you can also think about implications in mathematics. Like, you know, mathematics is an area where here are the axioms for every area of mathematics that's commonly pursued today. So, small number of axioms, about 3 million theorems in the published literature of mathematics derived from these axioms. You can sort of ask questions about why are these the axioms that we use and not other ones? What's the space of all possible mathematics is? And you can go and start doing things like you can start saying, well, let me just enumerate possible mathematicses, and you can just represent them by axioms going down the left and say, what are the theorems that might be true in each form of mathematics? And so, you know, across every line is like one field of mathematics, and there's a black dot every time a theorem is true for a particular field of mathematics. You might say, where are the fields of mathematics that we sort of know and love in this whole thing? And you can ask, for example, for, let's say, Boolean algebra. You can say, let's see, where do we have this here? So those are some standard axioms for Boolean algebra. And if those were sort of the simplest axioms for Boolean algebra, then in the space of all possible axiom systems, Boolean algebra will be far, far out. But it turns out, I found quite a long time ago now, that you can just search, just like you search for possible universes, you can search for axiom systems for Boolean algebra. Turns out you only have to search through about 50,000 axiom systems, and that one at the bottom right there is the simplest axiom system for Boolean algebra, and it's about number 50,000. And there are other sort of well-known axiom systems like group theory and so on. I think abelian group theory shows up around axiom number 30,000 and so on. But there's all these other sort of generalized mathematicses that exist out there, and those are things that are interesting to study. And in fact, what one realizes is that there's a lot of, when we just sort of enumerate things in the computational universe, we kind of get a different view of what possible things there are to study and what possible models there are for things in the world. I might just say, just jumping to a different thing, one of the things that's been important for us is not only can you use sort of the study of the computational universe as a way to understand nature and to find a sort of raw material for models of things. And actually, I should say one of the things that's been interesting, it's now a decade since my big New Kind of Science book came out, and it's been sort of interesting to assess the sort of what's happened with the things in the book. And so I did a kind of a bit of an assessment a year ago now. And one of the interesting things is if you look at new models that have been made in different areas, the rate of new model production is not that great, even at sort of the best of times. But it used to be the case that sort of all new models that were made were based on mathematical equations. Increasingly, it is true, and I think by now the majority of freshly made models are actually program-based models, not equation-based models. So that's sort of an interesting trend that's happened. But beyond making models for things, another direction is thinking about technology. And in a sense, technology is taking what exists in the physical world and harnessing it for our particular technological purposes. And what we realize is that there's this whole computational universe out there, and we can go and take things from this computational universe and harness them for our technological purposes. So what does that mean? It means if we want to discover an algorithm for something, we can go out into this computational universe and just go search 1 trillion possible algorithms and find the one that is good for the particular thing that we want to do. And that turns out to be a methodology that we have increasingly used in Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha and so on. It's remarkable. What you end up getting are these algorithms where you say, you look at it as a human, you say, this is really clever, I never would have thought of this. But it's something that you can prove works, and you just find it by doing sort of this algorithm discovery in this big space of possible algorithms. So anyway, this was a sort of some kind of science that I did, one of the things that happened as a result of the science is I started thinking about kind of some basic questions about well, I've been interested for a long time in the following thing. In how do you take sort of knowledge that exists in the world and make it computable in the sense that given that if there's a question that can in principle be answered on the basis of knowledge that's known, make it automatic to do that. Anyway, so the thing that, so I had sort of imagined that to be able to build a system that would take sort of knowledge in the world and be able to answer questions on the basis of it, you'd have to build an AI. You'd have to build a brain-like thing. What I realized was, you know, that's just not consistent with what I claim about the principle of computational equivalence. What the principle of computational equivalence tells one is that there really isn't a sort of bright line distinction between the intelligent and the merely computational, so to speak. And there are all kinds of fun things that you start to think about kind of understanding, I don't know, like there's this sort of thing, you know, the weather has a mind of its own. What does this mean? Well, it's kind of, well, we've got these, you know, processes going on in the atmosphere, and they're actually computationally just as sophisticated as things going on in our brains. Or we think about, you know, searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. You know, how do we make a distinction between sort of the complicated process that we're seeing the output from that comes because something's happening in the magnetosphere of a pulsar versus this whole civilization built up that decided to make computers and math and all these kinds of things. And so you start realizing from this principle of computational equivalence that if that's really correct, then it has implications about, you know, there really isn't a bright line about what's intelligent and what's merely computational. So that means there's no excuse for not trying to build a big sort of computational knowledge engine that can take all this knowledge about the world and make it computational, so to speak. And so that was what caused me to start thinking, yes, I should be able to build something like that, and that turned into Wolfram Alpha, where kind of the idea is that was sort of a project where it was kind of the goal was to sort of take all this knowledge that exists, sort of curate all the data in all these different domains, learn about all the different algorithms that get used in different areas of science and engineering and other kinds of things, and sort of make it all make it possible to do all these things automatically. Let's see if I can. I don't know whether this is going to work. And I'm also, perhaps I can show you, I'm sure you've all seen, I hope have you all seen Wolfram Alpha in some way or another? Yes? You know, a lot of things that I should just say that they're, between Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha, there's sort of, we have these two interesting pillars of technology, because in Mathematica, we've sort of been building up this kind of giant web of algorithms. The principle of Mathematica has been kind of a different principle from what most programming languages and so on have adopted. Rather than saying we just have this little tiny language and then there are a bunch of libraries that implement different kinds of things, we have this sort of integrated system where we're trying to just implement all the algorithms. Any piece of sort of computational work that is well-defined and sort of algorithmically implementable, we'll try to implement it. So that means, you know, whether it's graph theory or image processing or control theory or combinatorial optimization or whatever else, that's an integrated thing in Mathematica. And sort of that's been an important principle for us to kind of have everything be unified and integrated in Mathematica. Let's do something. How about text size? Yes, that I can. Find the pop-up. Oh, the pop-up pops that way. That's good. So you know, I can do my traditional Mathematica kinds of things, which I bet I can't really do very well without looking at what I'm typing. That's there. Okay. Actually, you know what? I can do this. I can say, you know, something like plot a tangent curve. Well, let's say no. That's an ambiguous thing to say. Plot a sine curve there, and this is now going to Wolfram Alpha to go and which I can't do because I don't have network. But it worked. Really bizarre. Okay. Or I could say, you know, here we can say, oops, you know, no, that's not going to work. That's definitely not going to work. It might work. Spell checking might do that, but and now we can go ahead and, if we want to, we can say, well, let's just do something simple like say, you know, edge detect the elephant there, and we can get the result there, and we could go and actually we can go and do all kinds of things where we're sort of integrating different kinds of functionality together to get results. One of the things that's been sort of interesting for us is having access to all these kinds of algorithmic functionality allows us much more easily to build kind of new algorithms that people have never seen before, and sort of to go beyond the state of the art in different areas in building algorithms, because we get to sort of use as components for those algorithms kind of big chunks of algorithmic work from other places. And the other thing that's sort of a big feature of Mathematica is kind of this idea of automate everything. So have it be the case that, you know, human defines goal for computation. We use some sort of meta algorithm that picks between a bunch of different specific algorithms to work out how to actually solve a problem. So anyway, it's been kind of there's Mathematica, there's Wolfram Alpha, which is kind of much more of the drive-by approach to computation, where you're just feeding in kind of natural language, and you know, if you use Siri, for example, on the iPhone, any kind of knowledge result from that comes from Wolfram Alpha, and if you scroll down all the way to the bottom, at least, you'll see a nice Wolfram Alpha signature line there. Same kind of thing with a bunch of other knowledge sources. It's kind of interesting that you get to sort of combine this idea of computational knowledge with an actual programming language. You can just get data into the Wolfram language inside Mathematica and do things with it. Actually, in the future, you'll be able to get all the stuff that's inside Wolfram Alpha. So whatever kind of thing we might ask. Let's see. Let's type Caltech into Wolfram Alpha. See what we know about Caltech, and see how correct or not. Okay, and okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, I don't know if that's right. Is that roughly right? Oops. It should have. So you know, there's kind of data in. Let's try some kind of. Oh, this is. It'll show us all kinds of interesting things there if we wait long enough. But or we could say, you know, Caltech versus MIT or something. And we can, so what's interesting is sort of combining kind of the Wolfram Alpha knowledge and computing things from knowledge with kind of the mathematical Wolfram language world. Sort of one type of thing is being able to upload data to Wolfram Alpha for analysis and to sort of combine your data with things that are in the outside world. Oh, wow, it actually came up. Let's see. I was just talking to someone about this earlier today. The question of, okay, annual degrees awarded. There's the, well, if it only comes up. There we go. Okay, interesting. Okay, I'm not going to try and demo this anymore because it's going to be too slow. But so a lot of things that we're sort of interested in terms of connecting Mathematica, the Wolfram language, Wolfram Alpha, to, for example, lots of kinds of devices. I've been interested in personal analytics. So, for instance, I was showing actually earlier, this is a plot of every piece of email that I've sent for the last 23 years, and I've collected lots of data about myself, probably more than any other human, for better or worse. And like that's the my average daily schedule for the last year or so, and you can deduce lots of things about yourself. Like that's when I was. Here's one. This is when I was. I scanned all paper documents that I have, and this shows. Oh, you don't see the X scale. That's no fun. But that shows years, and the peak is in 1984. So that's the year that I basically stopped increasing the amount of paper I generated and started going electronic. Actually, we've now got a lot of data from other people as well, because we have this sort of connection to from Wolfram Alpha to people's Facebook profiles. That's like given that you're a particular age, that's a distribution of ages of your friends, or this is the probability as a function of age that you have various kinds of relationship statuses. It looks remarkably like chemical reaction results and things. Actually, surprisingly, it agrees really well with the Census Bureau data, the stuff that you get from Facebook. Or you can ask, where do people migrate between countries in the world? And that's the thing that shows you various flows for humans. Or you can ask things like this was a nice thing we just did this a few weeks ago actually. This is kind of I mean all these results from Facebook are just from a few weeks ago. This is just using natural language processing to figure out kind of how people get more or less interested, male and females get more or less interested as a function of age in various kinds of topics and so on. So anyway, the sort of a direction for us is connecting everything we have to lots of kinds of, there's all kinds of funky stuff you can see there. It's remarkably stereotypical, which is really disappointing to me. So the thing that we've been interested in kind of connecting all possible devices and feeds of data to our technology stack, and so we've gotten involved with lots of kinds of sensor companies and so on that are making all sorts of funky sensors and so on, and there'll be lots of stuff coming along those lines. But back to my story for what it's worth. So kind of my plan B back in 1986 was build Mathematica, have a tool and an environment for doing the things that I wanted to do. Ended up spending a decade basically doing basic science, which then made me realize that I could do a bunch more technology, and then started building Wolfram Alpha. Now we have Mathematica, Wolfram Language, Wolfram Alpha, and now we're able to just build all kinds of interesting things. So for instance, coming soon is a cloud version of the Wolfram Language where you can sort of write a few lines of code in the cloud. You can instantly generate an API that you can then call from other programs. You can embed, you can get that piece of code. You can then get to drop out a kind of standalone lump of functionality that you can run on a little embedded processor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can do things on mobile devices and so on. Lots of interesting things happening there. It's actually a wonderful time for us because kind of we've spent a long time building up this technology, and now we have kind of the opportunity to deploy it in lots of different places. In terms of the business and the company, I've kind of my theory is to try and make the best possible machine that I can for essentially turning ideas that I have into real things. And now the company, I've kept the company fairly small. It's still only about 700 people, and it's a private company. And the fact that it's a private company is kind of important for the kinds of things that we do, because it meant that it's just my decision. If we go spend a bunch of money building Wolfram Alpha, I don't have to ask anybody, I don't have to convince anybody it's going to work. In fact, nobody was, even my management team was very unconvinced that it could possibly work. So that's been a really good feature, and sort of interesting seeing a company grow up. As I say, Mathematica will be 25 years old in June 23rd of this year, and it's sort of interesting watching the sort of progress of a company like ours. We've had lots of very talented people, and lots of people who kind of didn't quite know what they should do. They knew they were very talented. They got in PhDs. They got so actually sort of we have a more or less equal distribution of PhDs, master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, and then some things tailing on both ends of people who just high school or never finished high school, but learned to be great programmers and things like that. And people who were, postdocs, professors, things like that on the other end of the spectrum. And it's actually always bizarre to me that I noticed recently that in our advanced R&D group, we actually have the majority of people in that group. Well, there's a distribution, but the majority, for one reason or another, never got college degrees, which is kind of a weird feature of the very selected, subgroup of our rather selected company happens to have that attribute. But it's been an interesting. In my own efforts have been. What I like to do is figure out products to build, strategies for doing things, solving technical problems, and so on. And it's been very nice that it's been possible to build sort of an organization where I get to spend essentially 100% of my time doing those kinds of things. My general theory of building the company is sort of on day one, the original founder of the company has to do everything and has to understand everything about the company, make all the deals, build all the technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As you grow the thing, you start to realize how some of those functions work, and then you hire people who perhaps can do those functions better than you can do them, and that's how you grow a company. And anytime I don't understand some particular part of what we're doing, it's typically not being done very well. So, and that's, over the years I've sort of there's some areas which I'm just not that interested in that we've never really emphasized that well. Actually, we're about to do a new experiment because we kind of got frustrated that we have many more ideas that we generate in the company and that we prototype in the company than we can actually take into production. That's one feature of being a private company, is we don't get to just say, okay, investors, pour a bunch more money into us in order to pursue these kinds of things. Actually, we've in the last few years, we've been doing sort of this experiment of spinning off companies from our company and having those other companies kind of get wings on their own. And that's been fairly successful. And so now we have this fund which we're going to be sort of officially announcing and so on soon, which will allow us to spin off companies from our main company, taking the sort of technology we've developed. This is kind of a business experiment, and I view it's sort of interesting for me because I've spent a long time designing computer languages and so on, and it's sort of interesting for me to take the methodology that one has for designing computer languages and apply it to designing products and designing business setups. And I found that it's surprisingly similar. Actually, an interesting comparison for me is between doing sort of basic science and doing these kinds of technological and business kinds of things. And I have to say that there's remarkable similarity between these kinds of things. So, for example, in basic science, I've always found it most important. You have to understand with clarity what's going on in a particular situation. That's essentially the exact same thing you have to do in designing, a computer language or something. In designing our language, it's the thing that happens. It's really great for me because between the Wolfram language and Wolfram Alpha and so on, I get to learn about sort of a very large collection of different kinds of things, because one of the things I've realized is you can't actually design it properly unless you have a pretty deep understanding of what's going on. And it's been over the years, I started off doing physics, but over the years I've sort of progressively learned about lots and lots of different fields, and it gets easier after a while. And there's sort of a methodology for learning a new field where you sort of say, well, there's certain types of people in the field that are worth talking to, other ones who will be too kind of specialized in particular directions. There are types of ways to think about learning different fields, and I found that very, very interesting and so on. I think, so I'm not sure I could, well, so the thing that maybe I should, maybe it would be more interesting for you guys to ask me questions about things than for me to, so I don't know what the conclusion is from my sort of story of my life and times. That's, I have to say that I've been, it's kind of fun for me because, you know, you go through life and there are different times there are, you know, you're sort of highly tracked in doing some particular thing for some amount of time, and at other times there's sort of a very large number of possibilities open. It's kind of neat that I've had multiple times when there are a large number of possibilities open. Now happens to be one of those times, and so then the challenge is, okay, you know, you've got 10 different things you can do. You've got a bunch of different startups you can start. You've got basic science to do. You've got this to do and that to do. What do you choose to do? And, you know, I tend to work on the principle that I have these projects that I kind of think I'm going to do sometime, and I kind of carry them around for a decade or two or three until sort of the ambient situation and ambient technology is to the point where it actually makes sense to sort of pounce and really do the project. But actually right now I'm kind of snowed under with things that are actually now doable, so to speak, which is kind of exciting. But it's sort of an interesting and different kind of challenge, and it feels very different, and it's sort of been interesting as I've worked in different areas. I mean, I can compare what it was like doing theoretical physics back 30 years ago at Caltech with what I do today, and I would say that I get to do a much larger fraction of my time today is spent doing things that I think are really intellectually non-trivial than, you know, when I was doing physics, there were these nice peaks of, you know, yes, I'm figuring something out and so on, and then there was lots of kind of tool building and sort of just more mundane kinds of development work, and it's sort of been nice that I've been able to get to the point where I can spend most of the time sort of thinking about ideas and strategy and so on. But anyway, I should stop there, and please ask me questions and so on. Yes, a question, please.
You mentioned that the basic approach to Mathematica is algorithmic. Does that mean it's modular, and is that the optimal way of producing larger algorithms?
So you say, well, okay, so it is in a sense, in some sense it's very modular, and in some sense it's very non-modular. The sense in which it's very non-modular is that every piece has to fit with every other piece. So, you know, when we add some piece of functionality over here for doing, let's say, control theory, it has to be consistent with the way that things work over here for doing, I don't know, combinatorial optimization or something. And that's very important, and that puts a lot of constraints. And so for a long time, you know, I was the main person who did the design analysis of figuring out how to add each new piece. Gradually, probably about 15 years ago now, I kind of taught a group of people to do that really well. And it was kind of a bizarre thing because, you know, the design analysis group ended up being people who kind of, in an almost sort of Talmudic way, knew all the details of every decision we'd made, and they'd read the minutes of meetings where decisions were made and so on, and they could say, yes, you know, 5 years ago we made this decision to make this function work this way, and that probably wasn't the best decision, and this is why we did that, and we shouldn't make the same mistake again, or there's this other function that works this way, and so on. So in a sense, every piece has to fit with every other piece. And that's very important for you know, the ability to grow the system in a kind of recursive way. It's also very important for learnability for people. It's just a really good thing, but it's hard to achieve. It's internally in the implementation, it's beautifully modular. I mean, it's very easy to add a piece, and you know, it just makes use of all this structure that you know is there because it's sort of part of the main system. Interestingly, in Wolfram Alpha, there are some parts that are modular, and there's some parts that are profoundly unmodular. So, for example, you know, you have all these different domains, and each domain is sort of separate, but then you have the linguistics on the top, and unfortunately, English is not modular. And so, you know, the thing that happens is, you know, you add some new different piece of linguistics, and that could step on something that, you know, you add something over here, and you think it's about economics, but actually it steps on something about football or something. And that's a very non-trivial thing to disentangle those things, and there's a big sort of discipline of QA that's necessary to deal with that non-modularity. And it's actually, you know, we have a process, we actually push a new version of the Wolfram Alpha code base basically every week, and which is quite non-trivial. That's an important thing because it's actually rebuilt internally every hour, and it goes into testing every hour. and then we have about a 3-week-long procedure that gets it out into production, and pieces of it usually fail as it goes into production, and things get rolled back and so on, and we get a certain version out to production. But it's actually very important that we have this continual sort of drumbeat of releases, because without that, it just would get, things would go off track very quickly. And it's a horribly non-modular problem dealing with linguistics, because it's just, there is one language, and the language was never designed. Unlike Mathematica or whatever, there wasn't a designer for English, and so we get to be the we get to have that problem. Yes?
Have you thought at all about making at least parts of Mathematica open source?
It's not even clear what that would mean. So for years, so here's a few interesting facts. So for many, many years, the algorithmic code for things like integration in Mathematica was distributed openly with the system, okay? Nobody ever looked at it. And we know that because there were comments in it, which I discovered after the fact, that were written in Russian, for example, okay? Because we happened to have some people there. There was a big tradition of doing integrals in Russia, and we hired sort of the last of the Russian integral table makers. And they left so I think what we've generally, so we use lots of open source software inside Mathematica. I mean, it's a great source for good stuff, but it tends to be the case that the open source ecosystem works best when there is a very well-defined target. You're trying to do this thing. It's probably been done before, and now one can do it in a nice, clean, smooth way. The kinds of things we try to do tend to be things which haven't been done before, and which also contain a mixture of things that are really pretty interesting and things that are just a lot of work. And the just a lot of work stuff tends, again, not to be something that gets very well done in the kind of sort of crowd type fashion. So it's been, I think what will emerge, Wolfram Alpha is obviously a free thing on the web, so lots of people get to use it there. The Wolfram language, actually, in its cloud implementation, you'll be able to use a bunch of it for free, which I think will be quite nice, and people will be able to embed it in lots of programs, and you can kind of rely on it being there. The other question is, how long does it take somebody to become productive to actually, add functionality to our system? And that's another question. For example, we have a volunteer network of data curators for Wolfram Alpha, and they can do a certain set of things. But beyond some level, we would have to train them significantly to be useful to us. And when it comes to actually working on the sort of core kernel code of things, it's about 6 months before people can become productive. And that's something which, again, you can't really expect that to work in an open source fashion. Plus, we don't have a business model. If we made a bunch of our system open source, I don't know a business model that would support what we do. Business models are gradually changing. I mean, what we're doing with in the cloud and mobile and so on is different from what we've done in sort of prepackaged software. Things will evolve, maybe things will. But right now, I don't see the value of it, and I don't see a business model for it, so it isn't going to happen.
So
yes.
I have a microphone.
Yes.
I win.
Good.
So in our universe, if you start looking deeper at things, there's a certain level events are essentially random due to uncertainties, quantum uncertainties. And I was skeptical when I first listened in the beginning of the talk about cellular automata and how you are trying to find maybe there's a simple principle to describe our universe, because there are random events. But then the quantum cellular automata number 30, you showed that there are some randomness there. And my question is is it somehow rigorously proven that these things are really random? You know that they're random, and they're random in a full sense of
what random. Do you mean by random? I mean, I can, in some sense, Rule 30 is profoundly non-random, because you know what? It just starts from that one little tiny rule at the bottom there. So now the question is, how does the universe work? So sort of a big version of that question is, in a sense, the randomness of the bits here is like the randomness of the digits of pi. And the question is the universe kind of unfolding like the digits of pi are being computed, or is it there's sort of an alternative possibility, which is the universe not something which can be computed in that kind of way? So I think when you ask about randomness in quantum mechanics and things like that, this is a fairly complicated subject to which the end of the story is not known, but these kinds of systems based on networks and so on, they evade the ideas about entanglement and violation of Bell's inequality and so on that are supposed to be sort of the signatures of quantum mechanics. They are able to generate things that seem quantum-like, although it's not precisely clear what you mean by seem quantum-like until you've got the whole theory. But the basic way they do that is that because Bell's inequality and things like that effectively assume that things live in a finite dimensional space, that you're in three-dimensional space and that you've got an event here, an event there, and that there's no sort of honest way that there can be communication between these events. When you have a space that is made from the limit of a network, there is no sense in which the thing, it's free to have little pieces of the network that kind of connect distant parts. And so this sort of entanglement actually becomes a very strangely direct thing because you actually have these sort of threads in this network that connect different parts. And actually in at least toy cases we can see how this works, and we can see particle-like excitations that we can see sort of get entangled in this way. Getting the whole sort of apparatus of quantum field theory and quantum mechanics out of this is something that hasn't yet been done. If I wasn't working on technology right now, I'd be working on the fundamental theory of physics. But I'm working on technology right now and having a good time doing that. And frankly, there's more positive feedback in the world from me doing technology than there is from me doing fundamental theory of physics. So that's what I'm doing right now. But no, the assumption is that there's randomness. The question of the actually, okay, I'll tell you a story that's of Caltech relevance. So way back when, must have been 1981, when I was at Caltech, I knew Dick Feynman quite well, and Dick Feynman and I tried to work on quantum computers, which at that time nobody had ever heard of quantum computers, and we didn't have that great. I knew him pretty well, and we had a great time interacting. But we didn't have that good a time working together because we had somewhat different styles. He was a great hand calculator of things, and so he would take some quantum problem and he would figure out on the blackboard or whatever, here's the question, and then at the end of it, there's an answer, and then he'd say, okay, I can figure something out from this answer. Well, I'm not a good hand calculator, but I do things with computers, and so I would say, well, I can compute, I can solve the Schrodinger equation or some coupled collection of Schrodinger equations, and I can figure out what's happening here. Let me just compute it, and I've got these results with these wave functions and all this kind of thing. Here are the results. It would say, I just don't understand that. This just looks like nonsense. And then I look at his whole calculation. It's like, how do you know whether these steps are actually right? I have no idea whether these steps are right. You claim the answer is this, and so on. So we didn't really converge on that. Actually, after I left Caltech, both Feynman and I were consultants at a company called Thinking Machines Corporation in Boston, where actually Dick Feynman's son worked there for a while. It was ultimately an unsuccessful company that made parallel computers. Actually, we used to sort of time our visits to coincide, and he would be a more negligent consultant than I, because he would say, let's hide away and do physics together when we were supposed to be here. Actually, one thing we tried to do for that company was we thought, let's try and make a randomness chip. Let's try and make something which will make perfect randomness of some kind. So we thought, let's try using thermodynamics to make randomness. And then we realized that you have randomness from thermodynamics. There's kind of heat that is producing the randomness. But what we realized is, in order to make a sequence of random bits quickly, you have to get sort of heat to kind of re-randomize things. And we realized you have to have kind of a randomness antenna hanging out of your computer to kind of pick up the ambient heat to be able to move things into the thing. So then we thought, okay, let's use quantum mechanics to do this. Let's have this little quantum bit that's really perfectly random. And I thought, okay, let's look up about radioactive decay. Let's find out, radioactive decay is supposed to be random, right? So then you start looking at the data. Turns out people say, well, it isn't really random because you have a detector, and the detector, in order to go from this little quantum bit to the amplified thing that you can measure classically, has to build up all kinds of crud. And if there isn't crud in the detector, then you haven't really made a definitive quantum measurement. If it isn't almost thermodynamics going on in the detector, you can kind of have something where it could you could get interference and you would not have made a definitive measurement. So we ended up realizing, so I came up with the speculation that actually measuring random quantum bits, that actually you would end up with having to have, actually in radioactive decay, it turns out there was 1/f noise in a bunch of the data. So there wasn't actually, when you thought there was randomness, there wasn't actually randomness. But be that as it may, one could imagine getting rid of that. But still, you always have to build up stuff in the detector in order to have the definitive measurement. I suppose and I actually came up with the speculation that really in the end the quantum bit wouldn't do you any good at all, and that in fact having the non-interference from the amplification would be what would have to give you, which could be like a pseudorandom generator, would actually be where most of the randomness was coming from. So that's sort of an example of this. Actually, to say another Feynman-related story, I mean, it was always at this company, I was always saying, I was always saying, that this company is going to fail. It has the wrong business kinds of ideas, and you can't sell a $1 million supercomputer for single users and so on. Let me see if I can find something here. Anyway, so I was let's see, someplace here. Let's see if I can pull this up. Maybe, yeah, this is my full life. Oh, look, there's my Caltech. I looked a lot younger then. It's very, very depressing. As the years go by, but someplace here, where was it? I think I had somewhere here. Oh, yes, there we go. Oh, there's a picture of me with Dick Feynman at a press conference at Thinking Machines Corporation, where we were talking about, where there was supposed to be a big discussion about a computer, and we were actually talking about the nonlinear sigma model, which had nothing to do with computers at all. But actually, and those are some notes from Feynman about my Rule 30 cellular automaton, where, will that work? Oh, okay, let's see next. That was about where he was trying to figure out, he was convinced that Rule 30 was not random. And so he and his son, they went on a vacation in Hawaii, and they shipped this rather bulky personal computer out there, and he was going to prove that Rule 30 was not random. And I was pleased when he came back and said, "Okay, I give up." But that was, I guess, those were some scratchings of his trying to decode probabilities and so on. Actually, one of the best compliments I ever got was when we were at Thinking Machines. I had, I was talking about Rule 30 and things, and Feynman sort of takes me aside and says, "Okay, I have to ask you one question, which is, how did you know that this, simple rule thing was going to make all this random stuff?" I said, "I didn't know at all. I just did this experiment, and I ran all these things and came out." I said, "Okay, I feel a lot better now." I thought, no, actually, there we go. So some point in the middle of all of that, he wrote me this letter, which I rather enjoyed, which was a letter explaining, this was when I was starting my complex systems research thing, and remember, I didn't write this letter about myself. This was written to me, okay? So this paragraph says, "You don't understand, quotes, ordinary people. To you, they are, quote, stupid fools. So you will not tolerate them or treat their foibles with tolerance or patience, but will drive yourself wild, or they will drive you wild, trying to deal with them in an effective way." So that was I didn't write that. That was written to me. So actually, no. Then he says, "Find a way to do your research with as little contact with non-technical people as possible. With one exception," he says, "fall madly in love." That's his advice, he says. So that was kind of so Feynman was, I was really amused a few years ago when I found this letter again, because I've spent my life running companies and things, and I've had a really good time doing that. And I actually find the people, I really like the people aspect, and developing, working with people. So he was wrong about that, but it was. It's sort of an interesting. I think that's perhaps more interesting reflection of his own views about these kinds of things. Although actually, I think he was better. He had better intuition about the world of outside of physics and so on, and about people than he would ever admit. He actually knew what the right thing was to do, but then he would decide, "I don't do that kind of thing. I'm not going to offer an opinion about that." But in any case, that was a long answer to a completely different question. But please, yes.
Okay. What pays for those 700 wonderful people you have?
what pays for we make money. We've been making money every year for 25 years. I mean, it's mostly, it's a mixture of things. I mean, it's selling Mathematica to people. It's Wolfram Alpha. It's all kinds of deals that we have for people, including Wolfram Alpha, in all kinds of products. It's that we have custom versions of Wolfram Alpha that we sell to large organizations. It's selling apps. It's doing a bunch of different things. From my point of view, one of the things that's great is to have a diversity of sources of revenue. With Mathematica, for example, we have a very stable revenue base that's sort of a mixture of, most universities in the US, for example, have site licenses for Mathematica, including Caltech, I think. And that's, that's great, I think, for everybody because people get wide access and we get recurring revenue from that. And then, government labs and companies and individuals and so on. It's a diverse collection of things.
It's a bit like your Microsoft Office.
What?
It being your cash cow that supports.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually Wolfram Alpha has paid for itself. It pays its way, and which has been I wasn't. It's cost rather a lot of money actually to build Wolfram Alpha, and it's been good that it pays its way because one of the constraints, as I say, that we have by being a private company, we get to sort of focus on pretty long-term things like the to-do list that we have for Wolfram Alpha right now is about 20 years long at the rate that we're progressing currently, and actually it will probably. I suspect we're going to speed up, and it will only be 5 years to complete what we have currently in the to-do list hopper. But it's still something where you might say, "Oh my God, there's a 20-year to-do list. That's just totally impossible." But we've spent 26, 27 years working on Mathematica. It doesn't fundamentally worry me that there's a long to-do list, and it's something that we can deal with from a corporate point of view. But it has. As I say, this sort of kind of new scheme that I have that involves spinning off companies that will operate in a much more traditional kind of business cycle is good. It's not so good. I mean, some aspects of that. For me, I really like building this kind of consistent technology platform where you can rely on the pieces and where we kind of have sort of complete control over the pieces. But that's, it's something where there's trade-offs to be made about how you do that. Yes?
I think you mentioned running in AI on the knowledge generated by the scientific community. But the problem is a lot of the knowledge we produce is not semantic or accessible or understandable by machines. So what do you think is the step? What do you think the steps that should be taken by the scientific community so that a lot more of our knowledge?
Well, so I mean, one of the things is there's a very simple thing, which is you write papers and you put at the end it says data that this paper is based on is available at this URL. Okay, so in my unscientific study of this, if you click on those URLs, they work a tiny fraction of the time. I mean, what's there is understandable a tiny fraction of the time. So I think there's this notion of kind of data-backed research where you can actually have a consistent place to put that data. So we're building a data repository that will be it's intended to be, I mean, from a practical point of view, there are a lot of funding agencies that are requiring people to make their data available, and we're kind of trying to provide a data repository where it will be possible for people to put their data, and because we have our linguistic capabilities, we can actually have we can actually figure out, if they have a species of turtles or something, we know the name of every species, and so we can figure out that is this canonical entity, that there's this particular kind of turtle. And in fact, we're probably going to have a thing we call Wolfram data format, which is basically a semantic data format.
I'm also referring to analytical derivations, as in the math, or you have papers in theoretical physics or math, and all of these don't have any data.
Yeah, right. So I mean, making sort of everything computable is an interesting problem. So for example, for math, we've been interested in taking the 3 million theorems of published theorems of mathematics and making them computable. And actually, we have a pilot project that we're doing to take a very small corner of mathematics, continued fractions, and try and get sort of all papers about continued fractions and be able to have them be put in computable form. And that's been an interesting kind of pilot project that's gone fairly well. I would say we haven't solved all the problems there, but in that restricted domain, we're trying to make it so that it's sort of a different activity, so the thing you really have to understand is that academia is about publishing papers, and it's not about producing computable stuff. And that's a sort of a societal issue in a sense, more than it is an issue of the technology. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, people get academic credit, I think. I don't know, maybe it's changed, but it seems like people get academic credit for publishing papers. But for example, we had a big issue a few years ago. We have this demonstrations project, which has a bunch of our computable document format interactive documents, and there are a bunch of people who are professors who contribute to that, and so some of them wanted to get points for their promotions and reviews and so on from it. And actually, one chap who happened to be a law professor who contributed to that got really, really vocal about this, and he succeeded at his university in getting this to be a valid thing that counted as a publication. But that's just one university, and it was sort of an interesting process. But it was it's something where I mean, it's a silly thing. It's there's one issue, which is there's a technology problem. In terms of retrofitting, reverse engineering and retrofitting things. That's what we try to do with taking sort of the published literature of mathematics and make it computable. There's can one make it computable at the source? The answer is absolutely yes. But is that something that people in, for example, an academic setting will want to do yet? The answer is not quite. Now, one of the things that's interesting is this CDF, computable document format. There's sort of an interesting transition that's about to happen, which is, there was a time, so when I was at Caltech, when you wrote a paper, you wrote the paper out, and then somebody typed it, okay? And things happened. Like, for example, I remember, because I had actual calculations that I did in my papers, there were, well, I didn't do them, I had them done by computer, and you could always tell whether people were reading the papers, because they'd say, how did you get from equation 9 to equation 10? And some big complicated thing. But one of the more amusing things that happened that I remember is I had actual numbers, like 4/9 and things like that. And the very good secretary who existed in the theoretical physics group at that time, every 9 I wrote, she typed as a G, because she said, nobody ever has 9s. But the thing that happened, after that time was, tech, TROF, and then tech and LaTeX and so on came along, and then the actual, academics started to learn to, type them papers themselves. Now, also, I think with Mathematica, one of the transitions that happened was pre-Mathematica, the number of actual sort of science types who wrote programs themselves was pretty small. The number, definitely increased dramatically in terms of sort of who had access to actually being able to compute things on a computer. I think we're about to see the same kind of thing happen with, for example, creating interactive algorithmic diagrams that's easy enough to do in CDF that, I shouldn't say it this way. I was going to say it's easy enough to do that professors can do it. But that's what I mean by that is people who are not, who don't learn, computer science or whatever else, somebody can just do it. And that's something that is just now becoming readily possible, I think, as we have a bunch of cloud-based offerings and we provide a bunch more sort of automated user assistance and so on, it will become easier and easier for that to happen. I think that will enable sort of more interactivity to occur and more kind of, it's really neat. If you look at, for example, our demonstrations project, people have contributed their, 10,000 or so of these things, and people, there are little code fragments there, and people use those code fragments, and it really works, that you can, you really get a leg up from what's already been contributed. You get to say, okay, let me take this little piece of code. It helps that, Mathematica is a very succinct language, so you can actually take out a piece of code and understand what it's doing. You then pick it up, you use it for your thing, you build on that, and so on. And that's a process that really seems to work there. It's probably something that is fairly specific to our language, because if it was big lumps of C code, that's pretty unrealistic, because the pieces, it would be too hard to glue them together and match up the data structures and so on. But it's something that is now possible, and I think it's really a question, it's more a societal issue than it is a technology issue to make that something that can really be used in science.
Okay, well, I think that we've let you talk enough, and you might be tired, so let's all thank Steve.